In this video, I want to address the question, is behaviorism bad for democracy? Behaviorism and behavior modification have touched many of our lives, so I think that this is a very important question. First of all, what exactly is behaviorism? Alfie Kohn, who has written extensively about behaviorism, says this. He says that behaviorism is, quote, a psychological theory that would have us focus exclusively on what can be seen and measured, that ignores or dismisses inner experience and reduces wholes to parts. He also says that the behaviorist ideology believes that all we have to do is focus on observable, measurable behaviors, and that we can divide up those behaviors into little bitty chunks, and that people with more power can elicit the behaviors they want from people with less power by dangling the equivalent of doggy biscuits in front of them when they jump through hoops. So fundamentally, behavior modification is the application of behaviorist principles using rewards and punishments to try to control someone's behavior. If all that matters is behavior, then people don't have a sovereign personal destiny. This means that in order to create the ideal world, all we need are behavior technicians in a position of total power to control people's behavior. This sounds a lot like the worldview of Sauron. Kohn says, because behaviorism is, quote, fundamentally a means of controlling people, it is by its nature inimical to democracy, critical questioning, and the free exchange of ideas among equal participants. So on this question of, is behaviorism bad for democracy, one thing is clear. The person experiencing behaviorism, the person on the receiving end of it, is clearly not experiencing democracy. They're experiencing authoritarianism. Their freedom and self-determination and autonomy are being undermined. Behaviorism or behavior modification is fundamentally authoritarian because it involves a ruler using their power over people in order to control their behavior. So the people experiencing it are not free and they are not empowered. So I think it's fairly safe to say that a society that extensively uses behavior modification is going to be one in which important principles like freedom and self-determination and autonomy are impeded. Now, in the US, for example, where is it that we see a lot of behaviorism used? First of all, I think it's used extensively in a lot of different domains, in a lot of different places. But one place in which I think it is almost universally used to some extent is with children. We see it a lot in schools and families as well, where the basic premise behind most child rearing, I think, to some extent in our society is how can the adult who has power use that power to control the child's behavior? And of course, it's not really seen in this way. It's seen much more as the adult is helping to basically teach the child certain behaviors that they need to know. Of course, the unspoken assumption here is that the best way in order for a child to learn certain behaviors that they're going to need to learn for life is by the adult using their power to basically force the child to engage in those behaviors. And of course, it's also assumed that this approach isn't damaging, which I think is not a safe assumption at all. I think it actually can be quite damaging. One way, for example, that this behaviorist approach to children is justified is basically the idea that it's necessary to do this to children in order for them to basically fit into the job market later on. Because in jobs that they're going to have in the future, a lot of it is going to just involve basically obeying the orders of somebody with power over them, which is actually true. A lot of the jobs that we have in our society, to some extent, involve that. But I think that the assumption that treating children this way is necessary in order for them to learn how to obey orders in jobs later on doesn't really make a lot of sense. Is that really necessary to condition children in this kind of authoritarian way in order for them to be able to obey orders? No, I don't think so. I think that having the capacity to obey orders is probably not something that's all that complicated. Now, some of us as children, in response to this kind of authoritarian, behaviorist programming, we really resist it and we reject it. We dislike the fact that our sovereignty and our self determination is being eroded. And we, on some level, are maybe just beginning to become aware of the fact that relationships that are based on this are not really truly healthy, loving relationships, even if the adults with power over us have the best of intentions. Still, these are not the most respectful, fruitful relationships. And so we rebel against the authoritarian control here. I shot a video going more into detail on this dynamic, so I would encourage you to check that out if you're interested. Now, sadly, those of us who do have this kind of awareness and therefore resist this sort of control and this kind of behaviorist approach to raising us, we're often referred to as behavior problems. We might be pathologized and labeled and medicated. And I think fundamentally the reason for this is because the people that subscribe to this sort of behaviorist ideology value docility and compliance more than somebody actually operating from their true, empowered, healthy self. They tend to equate compliance and docility with mental health, which I think is a very, very big mistake. Now, another place where behavior modification is used extensively is the school system. All different kinds of rewards and punishments are used to rigidly control behavior, and it is very much assumed in the school environment that controlling behavior is exactly what needs to happen. And they sort of bought into an ideology that what a kid needs in order to develop is for the adults that have power over them to control their behavior. So in other words, they've subscribed to an ideology, again, where the health of the child or the teenager is equivalent to their own docility and compliance and obedience. And I think it's important to mention that the school system has millions, in the US, for example, has millions and millions of people that are involved. There are more than 3 million teachers in the US. There are many different administrators. There are many millions of parents that have children that are in the school system. So there are millions and millions of people who are basically subjected to the authoritarian control of the school system, where basically most people involved are required to obey that system to one degree or another, and behaviorist principles will be used to control their behavior. Whether you are a teacher, a student, an administrator that's fairly far down in the hierarchy, if you're a parent. So this is a massive, massive institution that runs to a large extent on behaviorist principles, that is authoritarian and requires basically unquestioning obedience most of the time. And so I think that we should be a lot more concerned about how this institution might be negative to our democracy. Well, it's fairly easy to make the case that behavior modification is bad for democracy and that it is inherently authoritarian. This perspective remains somewhat outside of the mainstream. I would say even still, though it may be changing somewhat, even still, the dominant view about behavior modification is that it is not harmful to democracy. If you asked people that use these principles on a daily basis if they think it's harmful to democracy, in the US anyway, they would say, oh no, of course not. And I think this is really interesting. And I think we need to ask, who is it that gets to control the narrative around behavior modification? Because we are told often that these principles, particularly with children, are used from a place of love and used to help them and whatnot. And I'm sure that a lot of people really believe that this is true. Well, keep in mind, if somebody is able to use behaviorism or behavior modification to control somebody else, that means that they are already in a position of great power relative to others. And so they're probably going to be the ones that are able to control the narrative around this. They're going to be the ones who are able to say and have society largely believe them that behaviorism is not harmful to democracy, that it does not subjugate and control people. Now, part of the reason they are convinced that it is positive is because they think that they are, again, teaching the person that they have power over. They think they're teaching them important behaviors, and that without it, they wouldn't be able to learn those behaviors. And so, because they use this kind of coercion and the person they're dealing with is relatively powerless, then they are in fact successfully able to elicit the behaviors that they expect. And so they think, wow, this works. We've taught this person these behaviors. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to do any of these things. And of course, stepping back from this and sort of observing it from the outside, it becomes pretty obvious that this whole narrative doesn't really make any sense. But these people have really bought into it. And then they propagate this narrative throughout our culture. So I hope that this video has been informative and helpful for you. If you enjoyed it, please share it with another person and also subscribe to the channel so you can get videos like this in the future. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to having you next time.